Okay, look, I gotta be honest, as a Kraken fan after this last week, I'd kind of rather just forget about hockey for a couple days, but the show must go on, and we gotta get to week 22 of the NHL Power Rankings. So here I am talking about successful teams, while the team that I cheer for has pretty much locked in a spot on the couch for the playoffs. But anyway, that aside, let's jump right into it with the first honorable mention, which is, for me, the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, the Lightning are in the top wildcard spot in the East, and it looks pretty likely they are going to make a playoff spot after flirting with not doing that over a couple months of the season, but they've gotten hot of late and had a fantastic week with two big wins, both regulation wins and multi-goal wins, even with an empty netter in both games, against two of the top teams in the league, in the New York Rangers and the Florida Panthers. So, for the Lightning, they seem to be getting hot once again at the perfect time if you're a Lightning fan, or the most annoying time if you're, I don't know, let's say a fan of whatever team gets the second seed in the East. And then with my second honorable mention, I have, which is basically the 11th ranked team this week. It's not always that way with the honorable mentions, but this week, the Edmonton Oilers basically are the 11th ranked team. And for the Oilers, they had a pretty mediocre week. It wasn't necessarily bad, it's just that the team that had been in an honorable mention spot for a couple weeks, I felt really was deserving of jumping finally up into that 10th spot, that being the Nashville Predators. And sorry for the Oilers, there's really not much else to say. It wasn't a fantastic week, it wasn't a terrible week. McDavid is somehow catching up to Kucherov and McKinnon in points, but aside from that, it's just treading water till you hit the playoffs and figuring out whether or not you're going to be playing Vegas or LA. Meanwhile, for the Predators, though, in that 10th spot, they had another very good week. Not the busiest week themselves, only 2 games, but those 2 wins were pretty convincing ones. 4-2 over the Winnipeg Jets, and then 4-1 over the Seattle Kraken, so we can forget about that one, but it's just adding on to what has been an incredible stretch for the Predators. Obviously, UC Saros is leading the way with a fantastic last couple months of the season so far, and a 14-game point streak now for the Predators, that although a couple of those have been overtime losses, they still have won 12 of those 14 games. And yes, this does mean that 4 teams from the Central Division are in this top 10, while the division that takes the hit is the Pacific, with just the 1 team in this week's top 10, though the Oilers are right there. Either way, for the Predators, who looked like they were cooked and out of it midway through February, having lost 8 of their last 11 games over the month previous, they go on this incredible run. Saros is giving up basically a goal and a half per game in the last 14. Meanwhile, you've got the usual characters carrying this team, well, carrying them at least offensively anyway, as Philip Forsberg is having a pretty good season. Sure, it's being overshadowed by some incredible seasons in Colorado, Edmonton, Tampa Bay, and Toronto, for example, but still over a point per game with 35 goals and 36 assists in the 68 games he's played. And then, of course, you've got Roman Josi, casually almost at a point per game from the blue line. So this is still a team that definitely has ways to score enough goals to get, well, you know, the 2 or 3 that they need per game to win with Saros in net, based on how he's playing right now. And based on how the Predators as a team are playing in general, just defensive structure around Saros with how well he's playing in net, this looks very much like a team that isn't just coasting into a playoffs or squeaking into a wildcard spot like they did a couple years ago and are going to get unceremoniously swept aside by whatever team they play at the top of a division. This looks like a team that could give whoever they end up facing, that could really be any one of 4 teams, either the Canucks or any one of the 3 in the Central above them. One of those teams, though, is going to get a very hard out in the Predators in the first round. Moving on, though, to the 9th spot, I still have the Toronto Maple Leafs, who also don't have a terribly busy week, only playing the 2 games, and like the Oilers, it was kind of a week as they go 1-0-1, but at least that 1-0-1 was a bit better than what the Oilers did, with their win coming very decisively over another playoff team in the Flyers. And then, although they do have the shootout loss, it is against the Carolina Hurricanes, who right now are playing as good, if not better, than any other team in the league. So having a shootout loss against them almost in some ways is like a win against a mediocre team. Aside from that, though, with the Leafs, it is basically the same stuff that I said a couple weeks ago. They're pretty much at this point just waiting to see which one of the Bruins or Panthers they're going to play in the first round, and seeing whether or not Austin Matthews can hit 70 goals on the season. Though I suppose it is worth mentioning that if you had told a Leafs fan a couple months ago in the middle of January that come the middle of March, Samsonov will be starting the majority of their games, they'd probably turn around and ask you where in the top 10 you thought the Leafs would be picking in the first round of the draft. Instead, Samsonov has had a complete resurgence of a season, and now that gives them a pretty decent looking tandem between him and Wool going into the postseason, which has not always been a strength for the Leafs in the playoffs. Whether or not it turns out to be a strength for them in the playoffs still remains to be seen, but it's looking good at this point in time. And then in 8th, I have the Dallas Stars, who I've got to admit, even though I don't typically cheer for teams from Dallas, in fact, I usually cheer against teams from Dallas, like any good red-blooded American that isn't from Dallas, I absolutely hate the Cowboys, and being a Mariners fan, I can't really stand the Rangers either. But the Stars I was kind of cheering for this week after having felt like I sort of shortchanged them with the 7th ranking last week. Instead, though, they come out and lose 2 out of 3, and while the loss to Florida is understandable, it's just a 1-goal loss against a very good Panthers team. Had they won that game, I probably would have moved them up in the standings, but then they followed that up with a 6-2, well, pretty much beat down at the hands of the Devils, before at least following it up with a 4-1 win over a Kings team that is technically in a divisional playoff spot, but really isn't playing like they want to be there. Even still, though, I wanted to try and keep them where they were in that 7th spot since I'd already felt too low the previous week. Unfortunately, the Jets had 2 shutouts, so I couldn't really move them above the Jets, and a team below them, also in their division, had a fantastic week and remains hot while they started to fall off, so instead they end up dropping 1 more spot, and I still feel like the Stars team can move the way up the rankings again. They, well, didn't play like it this week, but have been playing very well, and again are not going to be an easy team to face in the playoffs, whether they're facing the Jets or the Avalanche. It's probably going to be one of those 2 teams, but either way, it should be a very fun series to watch. Actually, I don't really know why it has to be one of those 2 teams. They could still just as easily win the division with the same number of points as both the Jets and Avalanche, even though they've played more games than both of those teams. They still could end up facing either the Predators or the Golden Knights, who are the 2 likely wildcard teams. So then in the 7th spot, this is where I now have the Colorado Avalanche, just moving up the 1 spot this week, even in spite of a perfect 3-0 week and a couple good wins in there, 2 overtime wins on the road against the Canucks and Oilers, and starting out the week well with an absolute stomping of the Flames. Still, for the Avalanche, it was hard to move up too much more with some good weeks from the other teams above them. This is another team, though, that is getting hot at the right time, and hopefully they can carry this going into the postseason, especially since my favorite team is unlikely to make it there. They'll turn out to be the team I probably end up cheering for. But anyway, that aside, which has nothing to do with why I ranked them where I did, this is, by win streak, the hottest team in the NHL with 6 straight wins. No other team, I think, has more than 3. Even the Predators, with their 14-game streak, have only won the last 2 games in a row. And the Avalanche, like I said, getting hot at the right time. Plus, it's helped out by McKinnon still, I would say, being the front runner for the Hart. Now, Kucherov definitely did a good job of closing that gap a little bit, certainly in the points race, where he caught up to within 2 of McKinnon with a 7-point week in just 2 games. So, I mean, never mind a week, 7 points in 2 games is absolutely ridiculous, even if it is 5 assists. Even with that being said, and for how good McKinnon has been for the Avalanche, this has still been the week or maybe even 2 weeks of Rantanen running this team. Okay, maybe not running it. McKinnon still does have more points in the last 2 weeks, 15 points in 2 weeks, while Rantanen has 12. Either way, the point is, Rantanen has definitely been overshadowed by his teammate, and I think is deserving of a little bit more of recognition here. Sorry, as a quick aside here, I was looking at the points leaders over the last 2 weeks. McKinnon and Rantanen are 1 and 3 on that list, or Rantanen tied for second. And the other guy there is Connor Bedard with 12 points in 7 games. So, yeah, I think he might be pretty good. I know, it's a hot take. As we keep things moving right along, though, in the 6th spot and staying in the Central Division, I have up next the Winnipeg Jets, who were kind enough in their final game of the week to allow the Blue Jackets to score 1 goal and not befall the same fate as the Ducks in the previous game against the Jets, as the Blue Jackets at least lose 6-1 rather than 6-0, which does make it the second of the last 6 games the Jets have played that didn't end in a shutout. Now, one of those was the Jets getting shut out 5-0 at the hands of the Canucks, but either way, the Jets have been involved in a lot of shutouts one way or the other over the last 2.5 weeks, and 4 of those shutouts were them shutting out their opponent. Now, yes, I'm well aware that the Ducks and Blue Jackets are not the toughest of opponents, and being that the Jets are as good of a team as they are, you'd kind of expect that they'd be able to take care of those teams and beat them at least somewhere along the same lines of a combined 12-1 score, but they still do take care of business, do what's expected of them, and also shut out a team that's at least a playoff hopeful, even though it's unlikely, a 3-0 shutout over the Capitals. Of course, yes, in the middle of that, they do have the one blemish of the 4-2 loss at the hands of the Predators, But again, this Predators team is beating pretty much everyone they faced over the last 14 games, so over a month now. It's hard to really blame the Jets for losing to them, even if it's not an ideal loss against a division rival, that even if they're not terribly likely to catch you, you're still trying to get enough points to try to win this division and face, I mean, if you can get enough points, hopefully either the Kings or Golden Knights. I mean, for the Jets, I'm sure they would love to face the Golden Knights in the first round and make up for what happened in the first round of last year's playoffs. With that, though, we do move on to the top 5, where we do have the same top 5 teams as last week, but now in a different order. In fact, all 5 of these teams have changed order from where they were last week. Sorry, Panthers fans, but you're no longer number 1. And in the 5th spot, that's where the Vancouver Canucks have landed this week. Now, the Canucks did not have a great week. They do lose both of their games, one of them being the overtime loss to the Avalanche, who, like I said, are the hottest team in the NHL, so losing to them in overtime isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. But then they do also lose their other game, a 2-1 loss at the hands of the Capitals, who are playing at least decently of late, but still not necessarily a game you want to be losing if you're trying to maintain enough points to hopefully get the top seed in the West. Obviously, though, for the Canucks, their biggest concern right now is not these last 2 losses or the 1 drop in these power rankings, though clearly that is a very big deal as these are important and prestigious power rankings. No, their biggest concern is clearly the loss of Thatcher Demko for an undisclosed injury that has him out between 2 to 3 weeks. And hopefully for them, Demko can get back in that 2 to 3 week time span and stay healthy, as they'll really need him to, not only because that's getting dangerously close to the start of the playoffs, but also because if they slip too much while DeSmith is having to spell these next couple of weeks, they could still potentially, with Edmonton having games in hand, drop out of the top spot of the Pacific, and even if they don't, they could lose that top spot in the Western Conference. That could make a big difference between facing a hot team in the Predators or a scuffling team in either the Kings or Golden Knights. Though, of course, with that, who knows what will happen in the next month, whether or not the Predators will stay hot going into the last couple weeks of the season, or if the Golden Knights or Kings might heat up, or heck, one of those other teams that's in the hunt there for the playoffs, maybe a miracle happens and they jump into that second spot. Either way, having the top spot in the West certainly could not hurt, and for the Canucks, that certainly is in danger with Demko missing time. And at least for this week anyway, as far as these power rankings are concerned, the Canucks do get jumped by the Boston Bruins in the 4th spot. Now, for the Bruins, this does come in spite of being blown out by the Blues at the start of the week. 5-1 loss there, but they bounce back with a couple of wins, even if it's a tight win that takes extra time against the Habs, and then a 1-goal win over the Flyers. So even though they do go 2-1 on the week, maybe they aren't the most convincing wins, and at least in the case of the Habs, not against the best teams, but at the end of the day, it is still 4 points in the standings, which they needed every bit of to catch up and pass by 1 point the Panthers for that top spot in the Atlantic. Now, the Panthers still have a game in hand, so it's not like this is necessarily theirs to keep, but with the Panthers slipping a little bit this week, it was the chance for the Bruins to jump on that and try to reclaim that top spot in the division. Though when it comes to that and potential playoff matchups, and I understand that no team is going to intentionally lose for a potential playoff matchup, but if you're the Bruins, you might not hate the idea of finishing second in the division and hosting the Leafs in the playoffs, especially considering the recent track record, not only of playoff matchups between those two franchises, but also this season where the Bruins did go 4-0 sweeping the Leafs. So yeah, maybe not the worst thing in the world if the Panthers end up winning the division and the Bruins get the second seed, if that means you get the Leafs in the first round, at least if you're a Bruins fan anyway. And speaking of those Panthers, in the 3rd spot and dropping 2 places from the top spot, this is where I have the Florida Panthers. Now, part of their drop of 2 places is because the top 3 teams had tightened up a little bit last week, and both of the other 2 certainly had pretty good weeks, while the Panthers, well, lost 2 of their 3 games. Now, as was already mentioned earlier on in the video, their week did get off to a pretty good start with a 4-3 win over a good Dallas Stars team, but then they followed that up with 2 pretty convincing losses at the hands of, well, 4-0 loss to one of the teams that jumps them in the Carolina Hurricanes, so spoiler alert there, I'm sure you'd already figured that out, and then still lose 5-3 to the Lightning, which they did fight back from down 4-0 to at least make that interesting in the end, and the 5th goal for the Lightning comes as an empty netter, but even still, to give up 8 straight goals, 4 to the Hurricanes, and then 4 to start out that game against the Lightning, yeah, it's a tough stretch of time for the Panthers that isn't going to keep you in the top spot. Now, sure, that little scuffle in the grand scheme of things here over the last couple games isn't a big deal when it comes to their chances to make the playoffs. They're still pretty much guaranteed, if not 100% guaranteed, to make the playoffs at this point. but it could hurt their chances of winning the division, and it does make these next stretch of games a little bit more interesting, as 3 of their next 4 games come against some of the best teams in the NHL. They've got the Predators up next, who we've already said are the hottest team, or one of the hottest teams in the NHL, then the New York Rangers, who we haven't gotten to yet in this video, and a couple games after that, the Boston Bruins in what's probably the most important game remaining on their schedule. Or I guess maybe second most important, as they still do play the Bruins one more time in the final stretch of games. So that then leaves just 2 teams left at the top of these power rankings, and also the top of the Metropolitan Division. And I gotta say, it's pretty close between these 2 teams, at least to me anyway, which one is the best in the NHL at this point in time. Which then does make it fairly convenient that they ended up playing this week, so I can just pick the winner, and that was the New York Rangers. So they'll get the top spot, and in the second spot, it is the Carolina Hurricanes, who lose that game 1-0, so proving how close it is between these 2 teams. Now the Rangers are also leading the division by 4 points, with the 2 teams having played the same number of games. Honestly though, the Hurricanes overall, I think, are the better team at this point in time, or at least they've been playing better. It's just hard to give them the nod over the Rangers when they lost to that team in the given week and are currently below them in the standings. Still, for the Hurricanes, they are a pretty convincing 8-2 in their last 10 games, and one of those 2 losses is to the team just above them in the Rangers. Now with the Hurricanes, I don't know what more I can say that I haven't already said in the last couple weeks. Everything seems to be going well for this team at this point in time. They're getting scoring contributions from all up and down the lineup. They bought huge at the deadline. Their goaltending has obviously come around pretty big here in the back half of the season and continues to play well for them. And when it comes to the advanced stats, they just continue to point even more that this is probably the best team currently in the NHL, at least at 5-on-5, where they are the best team defensively at 5-on-5 when it comes to expected goals against per 60, having distanced themselves a fair amount from second place in that category in the Florida Panthers over the last couple weeks, and the rest of the pack behind them. And then offensively, when it comes to expected goals for per 60 at 5-on-5, they're second only to the Edmonton Oilers, who have been way off in first for the entire rest of the season. And even there, they've got a little bit of a gap between they and the rest of the pack again, aside from, of all teams, the Pittsburgh Penguins, who are right on their heels in third. And I think it goes without saying that that kind of impressive 5-on-5 stats certainly lends to some, I would say, confidence in how they're going to play going into the playoffs, where certainly more of the game tends to be played at 5-on-5 than in the regular season. Though even when it comes to special teams, they're pretty good there too, after having worked their way up to 5th place now in power play percentage and 2nd on the penalty kill. So as it turns out, as the 8-2 record over the last 10 would suggest, this is just a very hard team to beat in pretty much any way. The only place they have been a little bit disappointing lately, or I guess over the course of the whole season, has been in their ability to finish, both with the goaltending, where the start of the season certainly hurts the season as a whole look on how that's gone, but also with their ability to actually finish offensively. Even for the amount that they generate when it comes to expected goals, they aren't always scoring at the rate that you would expect, or maybe I should say the stats would expect. Either way, it's been more than enough to win the majority of their games of late and challenge the Rangers for that top spot in the Metropolitan, and continue to press them, even with the Rangers continuing to play very well in their own right. Which does include this week as we move into that top spot with a Rangers team that, while we're on the subject, it is a Rangers team that, when it comes to those advanced stats, could not be much different, funnily enough, from the Carolina Hurricanes, at least while still being in a playoff spot, as they are actually below NHL average in both expected goals for per 60 and expected goals against per 60. The 2 teams closest to them in those categories, or the combination of those 2 categories, being the Ottawa Senators and DC Capitals. So then for the Rangers to not only be in the top spot of their division and above a team playing as well as the Hurricanes, but also challenging for the top spot in the East entirely, yeah, it means they're finding ways to win in just about any other possible way. Part of that has been very good special teams in their own right. They did fall just below the Hurricanes in this last week in power play percentage, but they've been very good there all season. Obviously, their shooting percentage has been maybe not challenging the Canucks, but always one of the top teams in the NHL. They've been getting good goaltending from Shesterkin, and in general, just finishing better offensively. Or maybe I should say finishing better based on what's expected from their offensive output and where those shots are coming from. Of course, regardless of how you get there, the points all count the same, and for the Rangers, they picked up quite a number of those this week, winning 4 of their 5 games. 5 games in a single week, including 2 back-to-back, so I don't know what the schedule writers were trying to do to the Rangers here in the middle of March, but that is a brutal week of games, and they came out of it with 8 of the 10 possible points, the only loss being that one to the Lightning that we mentioned way back at the beginning of the video. A 5-3 loss that's somewhat understandable, but you still have the important win over the Hurricanes, which was going to be a huge game to watch, and then 3 other wins against borderline or currently wildcard teams, the Devils, Penguins, who are pretty much out of it, and the New York Islanders. So aside then from that one stinker of a game against the Lightning where they give up 6 goals, I don't know if I said 5-3 or 6-3, but it is a 6-3 loss to the Lightning. Aside from that, the one they played pretty well all week long, giving up just 7 goals in the other 4 games combined, and scoring more than enough to get those 4 wins. It certainly doesn't hurt that Artemi Panarin had a league-leading 7 goals on the week, which obviously is helped by playing 5 games, and it is the same number of points that Kucherov scored in just 2 games, and Connor Bedard scored in 3. But either way, it's 7 points in a week, and that's pretty impressive for Panarin. So obviously, like the Hurricanes, even if doing it in different ways, a team that is firing on all cylinders at this point in the season, the right point in the season. 2 teams that were separated by just the 1 goal in the final seconds of that first period. A bit of a scrambling goal for the Rangers, but it turns out to be the difference in that game and the difference at the top spot of these power rankings. As for who will be on top next week, we'll just have to wait and find out, but for the Rangers, that's where things do get pretty tough, as their next 3 games are against Winnipeg, Boston, and Florida. Meanwhile, the Hurricanes have it a bit easier, not necessarily a ton easier. 2 of their teams are still playoff teams in the Islanders, the Flyers, and then the Capitals, but certainly not quite the same stretch of 3 games that the Rangers will have to face in this next week. Aside from that, though, let me know what you think down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams will be, what teams you think I have too high, too low, and how you're feeling about your team at this point in the season, if your team is in the playoffs, or if, like me, your team is putting you in a position where you're likely to be bandwagoning somebody else down the playoff stretch. But until next week, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken, even if, well, yeah.